Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's GTCS webinar. Today's webinar is Re-envisaging the New Normal, presented by Claire Lavelle, Managing Director of the Hive of Wellbeing, with Sharon Smith, Senior Education Officer at GTC Scotland. I'm Fraser Shand, and I work at GTCS as Digital Communications and Events Coordinator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You can submit questions by typing these into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in these questions at any time during the presentation. We'd also like to invite you to use this function to share your thoughts and reflections as we continue through today's webinar. You can also use the questions pane to raise any technical issues you have, and we will do the best we can to find a solution for you. Like many of you, we are adjusting to new technology and the perils of home internet connections, so please bear with us should we encounter any difficulties during the webinar tonight. Indeed, Claire has had some issues today with her internet connection due to the Virgin Media broadband outages. Hopefully we won't lose connection during today's webinar, but if she does and can't rejoin us, we will record a version of this webinar and send it through to you as soon as possible in advance of Claire's next webinar on the 8th of July. Materials from tonight's webinar and a recording will be available for GTCS registrants on MyPL and in the Health and Wellbeing Hub on the GTC Scotland website. Just search GTCS Health Wellbeing on Google to find this page. I would now like to introduce Sharon Smith to introduce tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Fraser. Good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks for tuning in on such a gloriously warm and sunny afternoon. My name's Sharon Smith and I'm a Senior Education Officer at General Teaching Council Scotland, and I've been working alongside Claire to bring you her wellbeing webinars during lockdown. Today's webinar has resulted from the feedback we've received from our previous webinars, requesting specific bespoke sessions to help support you, school leaders, through these very challenging times. I can only imagine that this week has perhaps been one of the most challenging weeks of your entire school career, and we are mindful that each of your experiences will be in some way very similar, but in other ways very different. Today, Claire will try to help you consider how you might envision the new norm for your context and how you can support yourself and your school team going forward. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Claire Lavelle to begin today's webinar.
Thank you so much to you, Sharon, and thanks so much to Fraser as well, and the GTCS for having me here once again, and this time to present to school leaders. Thank you to you all for participating today, all the school leaders joining today at what is, as Sharon pointed out, an incredibly busy and uncertain time and a gloriously beautiful day. What I had planned for today has been modified slightly since Tuesday's announcement. I think wellbeing just got a little bit trickier at the end of term, I fear, and I'll try and frame some of this in a way that I hope is supportive in moving forward. But let's be clear, what was said on Tuesday is still within the context of recovery. And I want to talk about that idea today about what we are each recovering from. I'll be very honest with you, I have struggled a bit with the preparation for this webinar today because the topic is massive about the new normal, the future, envisioning all of this, and particularly at the end of term, which already has been exhausting from all the preparations that have been made, and then the kind of upturning that has been done since Tuesday's announcement. I appreciate the expectations are having to change and uncertainty is rife. But I suppose with this indisputable challenge, I do want to open up a bit of a space to think today, to open up a gap, I think, that we might have felt on Tuesday evening, even yesterday as well, and just to take stock of where are we now, how we might be feeling, and as we sign off for a holiday of sorts, what have we learned as leaders as we've gone through this whole lockdown, moving into recovery? What is emerging for us? And what are some of the key questions that we may not have answers to yet, but at least we're asking them of ourselves and of others just now? So in all of the uncertainty, today is about space to reflect and to think, to process some of the things that are happening. I'll be sharing ideas and some strategies, some approaches relating to wellbeing, yes, but I also want to bring in the context of other studies that have looked at the impact of disasters and situations happening around the world internationally in the past, which might support us in being creative about our envisioning for the future and creative about our leadership approaches. So please take what resonates, ditch what doesn't resonate, and take notes if it helps. Watch your observations, see what comes up. And let's really get into this and begin, because the sunshine awaits, and I want to make sure that part of your well-being is that I finish up on time and you enjoy some well-deserved sunshine at the end of your day. So when we have uncertainty, we may be able to create some space, and there may be possibilities to transform what we do. But what we do has to come from who we are. I was listening to a Simon Sinek talk earlier today. He just recorded it a couple of days ago. It's a graduation speech. And he was talking about the idea to embrace the uncertainty, because in embracing the uncertainty, we have perhaps opportunities to really transform. It's difficult to maybe assimilate that today and absorb that today when we're feeling so exhausted. But just let some of these ideas that I talk about percolate, just let them gather some sort of momentum, even when it's right for that to happen. My offering today then, my very humble and I hope very grounded offering today, is this, taking an observer stance. What has emerged from lockdown for me in my school, for me as a leader in my school. So just taking time today to reflect on what's been happening for you. And also the kind of middle part of the presentation today is about taking my people with me during a time of recovery. Communication and compassion being key components at a time of recovery. Now, we may be very compassionate leaders at the worst and best of times, but compassion might be something we really have to focus on, because in taking a team forward, which is the third section, making those investments now to really invest in our team, making those deposits, as Stephen Covey talked about, those deposits in each other's emotional bank accounts, and build the trust that we need in order to take us forward through recovery as best as we possibly can. So a quote here from Einstein: I think we do need imagination. Maybe not for today, maybe it's just getting it started today, maybe thinking about things, and maybe as we go into the holidays and I see you again, I hope, on July the 8th to talk about your own personal well-being, we can also maybe talk about some of the imaginative ideas and share some of those as we move forward. But let me start with this. I've looked at a couple of papers, one by Davis and colleagues in 2010 and one with Walker and Warren in 2007. And they focused on the Hurricane Katrina that had devastating impact in the southern states of the US. And what each of the papers focuses on is that the account is taken of the context that preceded the disaster and the pre-existing conditions, and then how the disaster exacerbated the impact of those preconditions. And there are some examples here, such as environmental justice had not been in a good place prior to Hurricane Katrina coming, poverty, the public health system was in disarray, and although there had been advances in science, there had been a delay in the implementation to soften the blow of the hurricane. But it made me think about then COVID-19 and what were our pre-existing conditions, our pre-impact conditions that we had in our own school communities, and they will vary from community to community. But it's this whole idea that, in fact, this has not arrived alone. COVID-19 did not arrive alone either, and it may have magnified some pre-existing issues, but that are now no longer tolerable for us, and therefore we have to change what we do and how we go about things as a community, as a staff team. But it's also keeping account of perhaps there are also possibilities as well within that. There might be the impact of poverty, the vulnerability of our children, of our families that really came to the fore, and who's got them. And we had them, and we had to mobilise quickly to have them, and yet we pulled it off. What a feat that was. It might be that there were poor relationships amongst some team members before, but actually the situation with COVID-19, the lockdown, it galvanised the support, and we don't want to lose that momentum. And there is a risk that if we go back to what we consider to be normal, we lose some of that goodwill, some of that momentum, and that investment that we've made, as have our team members. So there's an opportunity here that as needs present themselves, We have a context and even a mandate to take action. And what comes out of these papers is this idea of how do we shape a new landscape for our communities. So at this point, I'd like to give you a couple of minutes to reflect on this and to move to these questions, to reflect on your own experiences. You might have pen and paper handy, you might have a colleague handy, and you're socially distancing within a room just now watching this. But whatever you need to do to just take account of your reflections, just consider some of these answers to these questions for yourself. What do you know arrived with coronavirus in your community and your school? And what needs have been highlighted? And what was the response to these needs? Also, are you starting to get a sense of new possibilities emerging? And I think the most important question of all of these is this, for your own well-being and your own sense of where you are just now. What have you learned for yourself or about yourself during this time? So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes, I say, just to reflect on that. Thank you.
Please feel free to add any of these reflections into the question pane if you'd like to share them with Claire.
So as we make our reflections just now, I wonder on that last question, the learning for yourself about this time. I wonder if there was a recognition about your own resourcefulness in ways that you'd never realised that you had in you before. Your own resilience, that you had to dig deep sometimes, but gosh, there was still enough in the tank and you could get through it. And also your team. Did you learn about the relationship you've got with your team and with your families, with your children? And as well as that, there will have been the struggles and the doubts, no doubt about it, because it really has been a roller coaster. So as we go through our session today, just keeping in mind those reflections, adding to the chat whenever you wish to. Because as the lockdown began, there was another paper that I looked at, and I offered this as support at the time. And I came across this article by McKinsey & Company. And what I would ask you to focus on just now, please, is the question, or the two questions at the end. Because the quote talks about what we need during a crisis is not a predefined response plan, but behaviours and mindsets. Because we know things are going to change. Clearly, things have changed quite radically this week. And instead of putting our energies and time into getting into that place of the reactions, which is completely understandable as well, but not dwelling there and thinking about that flexibility to consider how we do move ahead. We might want to consider what behaviours and mindsets have I needed as I've gone through this in my leadership, and are there thoughts about what I might need for August and beyond? Again, that might be a question too far today, that second question, but just to reflect on the behaviours and mindsets that have supported you during this particular time. And this was a very instructive piece at the beginning because the lockdown had just started, but it might be more of a reflective piece for us now, and as we consider our moves forward into our holiday period, but also thinking a little bit ahead, and that idea of August as well, because I know as a leader that it's very difficult just to switch off on the last day of term. Some of us, I know, will be going back into school next week because we prefer to look at what we need to do as preparation so we can find ways to switch off. And therefore, this process today, I hope, is a way to support that. And as we reflect, there might have been networks of teams that you didn't have to create, but actually self-organised around needs, because members of staff and members of the community stepped up. So how do we continue with those, and what are the possibilities for the future? Also looking at those leaders They're asking leaders to elevate and be deliberately calm. But how often were you mindful of this, and were you conscious of, absolutely, I need to be deliberately calm? And therefore, what enabled you to be deliberately calm when it was all terribly overwhelming and everybody wanted answers all at once from you? And also this idea of being detached. Being detached doesn't mean uncaring. I think point 2 and point 4 about that empathy, we still need to listen, we still need to be empathetic, but we can do it as observers at times. That I hear what you're saying, I understand how this must be impacting on you. What, as your leader, can I do for you at this time? Or what do you need at this particular time? Providing people with a realistic confidence in the support that they needed. And also, perhaps there were decisions that you couldn't wait for any big answers from other people. You just had to go ahead. Sure, you paused, you assessed the situation, the risk, what was needed, you anticipated what might be needed before others did, and you acted. And in the paper, they talk about old experiences to new situations. I think in this context, it was really resonated with me, this whole idea of, for COVID-19 or for lockdown, you don't bring the same learning from snow days and how you deal with snow days as to what you do with a pandemic. We have to take a different route with this. And also this transparency, frequent communication. I have been privileged to be working with school teams right through lockdown, and what is coming through time and time again is the gratitude from staff at all levels and from communities for the transparent and frequent communications that have been coming from leaders that have allowed them to stay buoyant, optimistic, and also realistic about the future. So what's worked for you? When do you give yourselves credit for the extra workload of that ongoing communication? So again, just something for us to reflect on just there.
Claire, could I step in with a couple of comments from Anne-Theresa? She said that positives emerging in terms of the power of collaborative working, and also the importance of connecting with all members of a team to prevent isolation. Very necessary.
I've been finding that a lot when there's that lack of the physical connection. We do find ways, and we need those ways to connect with one another so that people are not isolated. I also think as well, I've been hearing a lot of really good news stories about collaboration. And again, it's that whole idea of, well, if we're collaborating now, we must be mindful and conscious about continuing to collaborate in similar ways with a similar spirit in recovery and as we move forward. So again, I have been doing a lot of reading. So another paper, I'm full of papers today, but again, with relevance. This is from Hayashi and Su in 2012. Again, a paper on the impact of Hurricane Katrina, but also the impact of the Japanese earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear plant contamination in 2011. And what they talk about in this paper is the emergence of adaptive leadership. And I like that idea that it wasn't a paper that was instructive on adaptive leadership, that this emerged during this time of crisis. And it was deemed to be a really effective style in managing communications, in managing how people collaborated. And there's a really good example, and I can't remember the name of the superstore, but there was a superstore in Japan that managed, I think it was called Lawson's, a very English name, but or Scottish name, and it continued to operate at full capacity, even amidst a crisis, because they had been using adaptive leadership for a while. It had emerged even more strongly because at all levels, leadership had emerged because people had the permission to make the decisions and had the empowerment to do that. So there's something I think really powerful in this paper. And they also talked about leadership transcending the individual. And I know that as leaders, we all desire that, because if all the questions are coming to us and we're expected to have all the answers, we are depleted very, very quickly. And we may have found ourselves on some days, some weeks, feeling like that person who's to come up with all of the answers. So, as I say, networks of teams may have evolved, making decisions that we hadn't even anticipated, but this crisis enabled this to grow. There's also something here for me again about this idea of shaping a new environment, and shaping a new environment because the needs have changed. And also, what are the patterns? What is emerging? And I think as well, and I've made this kind of a template here just now, what they described in the paper was adaptive leadership consists of right knowledge, right people, right behaviour, and the right actions. And what I've done here is just put something together with some questions. And maybe it's a reflective tool for a team. Maybe it's a reflective tool, not for me as a leader as such, but for me as a leader to put to a team to say, look, as we move forward, we're all in this together. What do we need to know, and what matters to us now, and what questions do we still need to ask? When it comes to the issue of right people, there may have been times with certain aspects of us moving forward that we thought, gosh, there are certain people who are maybe not demonstrating the right behaviours, and I need people to demonstrate those right behaviours now, and I need those right people to do that right now. So being conscious of, we need all of our people, all hands on deck, but demonstrating those right behaviours. And a very good book that I found useful is Quiet Leadership by David Rock, where he talks about we can only influence people's thinking in order to get them to change their behaviours or to influence the way in which they act in those right behaviours. So I think that it is about putting the questions to people, to challenge people, to coach people as well, and to consider some of this. And then,
sorry, I was just carry on. I'll come back to you.
No, please go on. Please go on.
I just wanted to say, for me, I love this slide. I think it's a reset slide that either on the side of your office door as you're walking out, or as part of a CAT session you may have looking at discussions with teams. It helps focus the energy and where you need to spend that energy. And then when we get to that point of not knowing which way we're turning, this for me is the reset slide that can really support these conversations and make sure we're focusing our work in the right areas at that given time.
I think that is a very critical point to make when at the end of an extremely busy term and an incredibly challenging academic year, our energy levels are completely on the floor and maybe 6 feet under sometimes. So we have to focus on what is possible, what we need to do now, what is core to our workload, and what is core to the attitudes we need to all demonstrate in coming together, and what those expectations are. Because I think the real challenges are these. Sorry, did you want to come in with any feedback there just now?
There's some more here just now if you want, if you're happy to.
Of course.
Thank you so much, everybody. So I've had one here from Alison saying, I've been humbled and inspired by colleagues who previously were not forefront in leading within school, who've demonstrated skills and attitudes to lead in innovative ways, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Also, and I think we might have at least touched on some of Deborah's question here. She's worried about the team may needing support to galvanise again. And everyone has been working separately in presumptions about each other's circumstances and availability. How do we build morale and togetherness again? And I'm sure you will touch on a lot of this going forward.
Thanks.
Alison's come back and said there's something about breaking away from traditional approaches to open minds and innovative ways to tackle new problems. And treating people as the best version of themselves can really help. And that's Anne-Therese. And Alison loves this slide because it's a stop point for staff and a way for us to focus. And it's about our core values as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for all those contributions. When it comes to the questions around the teams and building morale, I hope to come to that as we come through the session. But yeah, please keep the questions coming. And if there's not the answers to some of this, I know that coaching is not about me providing answers and providing the questions, but as we go through, I'm more than happy to revisit some of this. I love that phrase, best version of yourselves. And I'm delighted that last slide, which, this will be available on the GTCS website. You can just lift it. Please feel free to lift it and to use it with my full permission to take forward.
And Claire, I'm sure you won't mind me saying any questions or any themes that come up from any commentary coming in, we can feed that into the next session on the 8th of July.
Most definitely, because the thing for me about the team situation is that although I want to try and build my team as best I can, I also have to take account of how I'm feeling and what's going on for me, and not it's that whole empty cup thing, isn't it? So yeah, definitely. Very much want to get that right and get the balance, but very much because we are faced with challenges just now, and I do want to touch on some of these right now. The challenges, or indeed those new norms, as Alison was saying there about new normal. We have, or I've been seeing as well from these surveys that I referenced earlier, really welcome comments from staff teams about the communication channels, the transparency. But of course, the caveat now is that as our work patterns shift, some of us will be now commuting to workplaces, and that hour that we perhaps had before, or whatever time, few hours we had before, that we would put into that communication online is maybe not there. So how do we make communication channels workable for ourselves? How do we support ourselves with that? And also, what works? It's that whole thing about we might use dozens of platforms, but actually, where are we getting the most impact, and what are people accessing and is workable for all or almost all in the best way it possibly can? I think that also ties in too with our ongoing consistent messaging as leaders. It's interesting that the UK government now have suspended their daily briefings, or have cancelled their daily briefings now, because maybe they don't see that communication channel as workable, that it's come to the end of its kind of lifespan. But there still needs to be a channel, there still needs to be information coming both ways. And therefore, part of our consistent messaging as a leader is also about how we do protect ourselves and protect our energy. And therefore, putting out a message to say, this is how I now intend to communicate, because this seemed to have been the most effective way of doing so during lockdown. I will continue to do it this way. But there's also something about the greater need for that consistent messaging in terms of, what worked in our consistent messaging, what kept us all on board, what kept us all focused. Also, it might allow us as well to set clear expectations. And I think for those of you who are new head teachers, or you are joining a school as their new head teacher for the first time, I think this idea of that consistent messaging may be very supportive, because what is going to be the key message? How are people going to relate to you in those kind of opening statements and those opening communications that you're putting out there as part of, and let's be clear again, a recovery approach? What's going to be at the centre of that? I also talk here about safety, everyone feeling safe. Now, I fully appreciate, having been a head teacher, you will be risk assessed, your school will be risk assessed to the hilt as it stands, and there'll be further risk assessments to carry out on the back of the announcement on Tuesday, no doubt whatsoever. And there's something here as well, maybe that's part of that messaging about my well-being as a head teacher, as a school leader, whether I'm a deputy principal teacher, leader of learning, my well-being is wrapped up in your well-being. And therefore, although I'm doing all of these risk assessments, you may still not feel safe, because there might be an issue with trust in some of this, or your own anxiety. So please, let me know what I can do, but I also have to be clear about what is realistic and what is manageable. And going back perhaps to those recovery guidelines about safe, fair and ethical, what is clear, and also what is realistic. And therefore, who has ownership of safety? And we all play a part in that. And also, I suppose, the ongoing psychological impact of what's happening. Deborah there saying about the teams, that in fact coming back into what we hadn't perhaps considered, but we are, looking towards now. What impact is that now having on our teams, and how do we as leaders mediate that and manage that? And I'll maybe come to that as we go on. And I think the assessment of ongoing learning, as well as, I think that ties in with excellence and equity. Of course, right across the board, recovery plans are focusing on the foundation of well-being. And although people might be saying, because I've heard people say as well, that we must remember that, what if children come back and they are ready to learn? Well, now we're also faced with a situation where they may be ready to learn because their home environment was conducive to that. But are they ready to learn in a new environment or a what was normal environment, whereby they may feel the overwhelm of coming back emotionally into this, knowing that they've been off for so long because of a virus, and how it's affected schools and how it's affected different areas. So that well-being, I think, will be for all, but that's not to say that people will not be at different places in their learning. And just this last area, workload, massive. And it has been massive, and it has increased during recovery. The amount of, if I had £1, Sharon, for all of the leaders that told me they've worked harder than they've ever done in their lives, I wouldn't be doing presentations, I promise you. No, I still be doing presentations, I would. But it's just been remarkable, the feats that people have pulled off at this time. But what happened in lockdown is perhaps just not sustainable. And as we come into recovery, I think we do need to focus on core boundaries for ourselves as leaders and what can be sustainable as we move forward. Now, I came across this was sent to me from a local authority by a very good friend from the RSA. And I think it's helpful in that idea of collective sense making. But as I was looking at it, I think it can be very helpful in thinking about, old practices that we've stopped and we've stopped forever, the practices that we may start and new practices, but also picking up the old practices that we know are still relevant. But for me, there's something here about, it's not only about practices and what we do. We're going to have to be coming from a place that is underpinned by who we are and our new sense of mission and our new values that may have evolved and developed over lockdown. So I think this is helpful, but to a point. And when we're having collective sense making, we are going to have to take in, I think, account of people's emotional landscape and what's been happening for them, as well as just the practices and how people relate to that. And I think that's what makes the adaptive leadership slide quite powerful, because it's considering what we need now and where it's coming from, and what will be our legacy with the right actions, right behaviours that we demonstrate now in recovery that can set us up for when times feel safer, more normal, whatever that may mean, or more abnormal, who knows. And I saw, if we were to kind of tabulate some of these, and let's take some of those practices, and this is just an exemplar rather. You can decide whether it's exemplary or not, it's quite different. But if we were to tabulate these, just thinking about these emerging practices, the behaviours, the trends, and what of these behaviours and trends and practices are smart, going back to that old crackery. And I saw a tweet, because Twitter is the fountain of all knowledge, isn't it? Something like that. But I saw a tweet earlier this week, and it talked about, let's not focus on simply what we have done for our school communities, which is very important, but also to focus on what our communities have maybe shown us, what feedback we've received. In that, have we noticed more needs? Have we noticed feedback in terms of reactions people have had to what we have provided? Or indeed, is there a kind of emergence of an idea, an innovative idea from the community or from our staff teams, or an appetite for change? Where are the appetites for making changes that are sustainable? And again, this may be a template for staff in moving forward and thinking for yourselves as leaders, what do we want to continue doing? And just to pick up on some of these, I'm just going to go to the central column just now. But again, going back to staff meetings online, maybe that's given people more sense of a work-life balance. That's what I've been hearing from people. And also use of the digital pedagogy has been really helpful in moving forward. Parental communication might feature during recovery as a major part of workload. I know that's been coming out of education committee meetings in Parliament as well with unions. So thinking about, well, if that's part of a new workload for us, something at the moment then will really have to drop off. Well, what is that? What do we really not know right now? So being really core with the work that we are taking forward. And this next step, full of templates today, full of ideas, but just to be mindful of some of this and being quite pragmatic with well-being today. Just thinking about, on an in-service day or in a future staff meeting, think about the feedback we've received, the trends, the practices, the smart things that have been emerging. How can we put that into an adaptive plan, and in a plan that's flexible and meets more of the more relevant priorities during recovery and during this time where we're trying to get back to some sense of normality? So it might be that we have to consider those previous ambitions. And I think it's so important to recognise there are losses as well as there being gains. And I think it's important because there'll be individual members of staff who put a lot of time and energy into programmes of work, into projects, into a whole host of things that perhaps now are gone, and are gone for a long time, if not forever. And so acknowledging that, and John Fisher's transition curve, which I've spoken about in previous webinars, I think is a very good place to acknowledge those losses and to talk about some of the emotions we might have experienced as a result of that, but also recognising that there are things we may wish to continue with, looking at those new priorities, and also what's emerging, and what are the needs, the priorities for children, for staff. Staff wellbeing will be high on everyone's agenda now, as we come into recovery, to make sure that they are as resourced as possible. And also this idea in this last comment of what we need, where will there be protected time and space to explore? You know, I'm able to present in this way and to have these thoughts and ideas because I've got protected time and space to explore. But when are you afforded that for yourself as leaders? And what are boundaries there for you? So I'm very aware then that there are those challenges, and I'm going to shift my emphasis slightly here, because if we're thinking about no crisis arrives alone in terms of its impact on our school community, on our plans, on our outcomes, there's also the impact it's had on staff wellbeing and on our team members. And I'm very aware that you know, we need to consider that new relationship with work that we all have, and recognition that every single member of staff has had their own experience of lockdown, and some of that has been more positive than others. And for those of our members of staff where it's not been a very positive experience, it's been very challenging, what may have emerged for them are new perceptions, new feelings, which are not always aligned with us trying to move forward. Equally, you'll have members of staff who have had time to reflect on what their mission is now, what their values are, and what they really want to do to move forward. So just recognising, and I think this is again coming out from surveys I've looked at, is that people, you know, very positively are thinking about work-life balance. They're thinking about the need for much more contact with their own families, and also their sense of empowerment and purpose in working through, you know, in different ways in lockdown. That's been really apparent. But I think that there will also be frustration at this time. And I think there will be frustrations from people's perceptions, which as school leaders, you are now going to have to mediate. I mean, let's be honest about things. On Tuesday evening, there will be a number of members of staff, and I know this because I carried out sessions yesterday in schools online, where members of staff, teaching staff, support staff were saying, I could weep. I was really upset at what happened. I feel just flabbergasted. I'm stunned by what's happened. And there will be perceptions from some members of staff that there has been a U-turn, and from other members of staff, there will be perceptions that, in fact, well, we always knew that this was the contingency. Now, it's not my place at all. I'm not giving any opinions on that. I'm just aware, and I am an observer looking in on situations where sometimes that polarisation is going to feature in some people's unconscious drivers, an unconscious sense of what they should be doing right now and how safe they feel. And therefore, when we are moving through this, I think it's important to recognise what we can encourage people to control, and to encourage people to focus on what they can fix. I think as leaders, there are certain things that, you know, we can fix, but I don't believe, and I did believe this when I was a leader, but I don't believe this now. In fact, latterly as a head teacher, I didn't believe it. I knew I couldn't fix people's emotional load for them. But what I could offer is I could offer empathy, I could offer support, and I could mediate as best I could their perceptions of what they believed or perceived to be quite polarised. I could try and reframe that for them in a way that would support them. And one of the kind of offerings I'd like to suggest just now are, you know, when there's so much uncertainty and when there's so much to be anxious about, rightly so and understandably so, it is about thinking, if I've got to scale this rock face, what are my initial footholds? Is it that as a team or with a member of staff, we do look, what is the worst case scenario that you're building up for yourself in your mind? Because let's, you know, share it with me just now and let's talk it through. Because as you know, we can all build up scenarios in our minds, and we may need that too as leaders to offload and to support one another with that, in a spirit of empathy and in a spirit of trust, because trust may have been damaged in recent days. So we are also looking to who do we trust, and I think there's something there about who do we trust, and also what allows me to trust them. Before I get to that, back to footholds, or I will go all over the place, Sharon, as you know. off on a jolly. The second kind of foothold, so worst case scenario is that first foothold. The second foothold might be this. Can we imagine the two parallel universes? Can we try and imagine and hold them in mind? A bit like the Matrix, a bit like that kind of moment. You know, those contingent realities and those universes. You know, are there two parallel universes? Do there need to be three? You know, what can we hold in mind so that there aren't no surprises? And we go, well, we're semi-ready of sorts. Or is it just a case of saying to members of staff, you know, what will help allay that anxiety? And how can we grapple with the possibilities? And again, I've got some tools to share with you on that. Back to that idea of trust. When I think about who I trust and when I think about what makes me trust them, I look at the attributes, I look at the relationships, I look at the criteria for that. And perhaps that's worth looking at in terms of who you trust and what makes you trust others. Because that may be exactly the attributes, especially if you're a new leader just now or a new head teacher, those might be exactly the attributes that people need right now from you. So taking that, you know, is it the consistent messaging? Is it the transparency? Is it the realism that, yeah, I don't have the answers either, but I tell you what, I am doing my best right now. And I promise you, as soon as I get more answers on this, I'll be sharing it with you. So just thinking about that. And that emotional containment and co-regulation, we're doing it all the time for numbers of our children. We're having to perhaps do this for our staff just now. And that connectedness, sorry.
Can I come back just a wee bit there, just on a couple of points, if you don't mind? Just something about vulnerability and how, I just think, for example, thinking of the First Minister and how she says as she goes that she's making decisions, but she's very aware that she might get things wrong and is actually just put it out there and has shown that she is vulnerable to that, but she's doing everything in good faith. And I think that's a really strong stance to take as a school leader just now, you know, to reinforce what you're saying about we're not having answers for everything, but that we have people's backs and we're going to be doing the best that we can with what we've got, the resource that we have.
I think vulnerability features greatly in this. It is how we build trust, and I think it features greatly in the connections that we make with one another, which I think ties in nicely with this upcoming slide. But before I get to that, there's also something about, as a leader, expressing with maybe more immediate leaders in your team, actually, I don't have the answers, and although I'm sending you to mediate things for teams, I've got your back on this as well. And we're all vulnerable together. And I get a sense of that from Miss Sturgeon when she's making those announcements, that sometimes she answers for some other people. And it's almost, people might think, people might have perceptions of micromanagement or whatever, but actually there's also something that's terribly supportive and saying, don't worry, I've got this.
I've got your back.
I've got this. But for leaders and for yourselves as leaders of schools, also keeping in mind, and this will perhaps be part of our next session, that Superman sketch of who's got you.
Definitely.
As you're saving the lowest lanes, tumbling from buildings, who's got you? So, but it's also about, perhaps you've recognised your team have you more than you recognised. It might be that your team haven't had you as much as you'd like. And that's another part of that vulnerability, which I will scoop up for people, I hope, in the next session.
Can I just also talk about my box set?
Oh, right, okay.
Going on just now in lockdown, so I've watched back-to-back episodes of New Amsterdam.
Right, although I don't know this one.
And in there is a medical director called Max Goodwin who runs about, and this is very non-academic, so apologies people, but his question, whenever everyone asks him to solve a problem, his immediate response is, how can I help? And I think that builds this real essence of social capital and trust, because his staff know that he has their back, but also equally empowers them to say what it is that they need to be done and how they would like it done, and asking for help.
That. Yeah, so how can I help? Maybe there's also, as a leader as well, with a team, how can we help? And again, just building on that kind of collaborative approach, how can we help? Because so-and-so was working on that the other day, or so-and-so had the same situation of what worked for you. And it might even be an emotional situation, and it's not necessarily something to do with online work, etc. So those connections are imperative and will continue to be imperative, and maybe imperative even during this holiday. That in fact it's going to be maybe just difficult to let go of some of those staff connections, both from your side as a leader, but also for staff members. And therefore, how do we, it's a bit like maybe coaching sessions or our own counselling sessions, you have a point where you have to kind of stop them, but you don't want to just stop them suddenly and cut off that umbilical cord of support. You want to just ease into that really gently. So those connections, and I think the way in which people share their stories, and as leaders, sharing our stories where we felt vulnerable, where we've not had answers, or we have felt at times, gosh, this is really hard. I know I'll get through it, and I know we'll get through it, but it has been really challenging. And I think, you know, I don't mind telling you, and I'm not mentioning the school, but I had a fantastic online session, a Zoom session, where the head teacher asked everyone to just disappear off screen as a member of staff was late to the meeting, was making their way back. And it just added a bit of fun because the gentleman came on the screen and saw that everyone had gone, or allegedly so. I mean, some people might perceive that as bullying. Perceptions are key, I understand. However, it wasn't. It was fun, and it was just a way of saying, we really are in this together. And I think that kindness is not simply about, loaning each other our strength at times because it helps other people. There's actually something in it for us, and there's something at a physiological level there for us, which I just want to maybe mention just now, which I've been looking at. I'm very interested on the whole themes of compassionate work, on kindness, and I know that Warleen and Dutton for a number of years, over the last 20 years or so, because I've certainly been reading their articles for a good number of times now from way back, they've been looking at this whole concept of compassion and as a social science construct. And we might not talk about the word suffering. We don't tend to talk about, oh, I'm having a lot of suffering today at work, a lot of suffering going on. We don't say it as explicitly. But any time we are frustrated, any time we are feeling overwhelmed, there is a sense that things are not quite right, and we do have a sense of suffering. And they talk about these kind of 4 steps, these 4 elements to try and awaken that. Now, we'll be doing this already. I'll not be telling anybody anything I'm sure that they don't know already, but to formalise it this way and to consider the impact it has on us. That when we are compassionate and when we are kind to others, it reduces stress levels. It reduces their stress levels because it releases a hormone called oxytocin, which has a nickname of the social bonding hormone. So if I have stopped to be present and to help you, then I'm doing so in a way that will allow me to show you I can be vulnerable with you and we can connect together. And when the oxytocin is released, the trust is also greater between us because we've had that interaction, and in our kind of neural circuitry and within our physiology, a connection has been made as well with that experience. And that's why the trust we build now, the compassion we show now, I believe is the new workload and is what we have to continue with. Now, people might say that's very controversial, I understand, but I think it is about that investment now for the future. Now, as I'd maybe mentioned earlier, sometimes for certain individuals, and sometimes for ourselves as well, we feel that sense of conflict, and it is a natural part of life, and it's very healthy. And in this model by Patrick Lencioni, he talks about the 5 behaviours of a cohesive team model, and he talks about trust being at the base of that. But he does talk, Sharon, you were saying earlier about vulnerability, he does talk about the authentic demonstration of vulnerability to staff as a leader at times, to say, I don't have all of the answers, but I'm really trying my best here. What are your thoughts on this? How can we work on this together? And allowing people the space to help, to be kind, to be compassionate, creates those bonds. And then conflict, when it happens, it's much easier to deal with in his model. And that's certainly been my experience, that although I'm going to come to you with a problem, Claire, and I'm struggling with this, I know that we've got a good enough relationship that we can really thrash this out. And I think that any conflict, although it might manifest itself quite emotionally, again, it's this idea of becoming the observer and going to a place of curiosity and thinking, what is the unmet need here? So although people might say what they believe the thing is, I've often found the thing is not the thing. And in fact, what people are really looking to express is their anxiety or their sense of perceived unfairness. Now, on that point, I'd also like to just make reference to, I understand that there may have been people during lockdown who have stepped up in a way in which they have been available for hub duty. They've gone above and beyond the expectations from managers, from yourselves as leaders, they've just really, really done so well with that. And then as we come into recovery, there may be sometimes a kind of inkling or a perception of they've worked so hard, and have others worked as hard, and they let's start to hear stories about maybe I've worked harder than others. Some of that can maybe cause a bit of that conflict. So again, back to that idea of consistent messaging. And I think for leaders, it's that sense of, look, everyone's had their own experience of lockdown, and everyone is going to recover out of lockdown in their own way, at their own pace. So that compassion being key for everyone just now, including those who might feel, no, I've worked so hard. And we need to maybe just, take cognizance of this. I appreciate that. I've always got so many slides and so little time. I'm so sorry. And I'll keep moving forward just now. But did you want to come in just now with other feedback, please?
Just to give you an update, we don't have currently any questions, and we've got 9 minutes left in the presentation, but there is a comment from Anne-Theresa who says authenticity in leadership is important. Seligman has shown optimism is a learned behaviour and important to share and demonstrate this. So a bit in line with what you're saying about compassion. It's
interesting because that Seligman quote ties in with Bandura and self-efficacy theory about how we can self-determine our feelings of well-being, and we can self-determine our feeling of optimism and positivity. So yeah, definitely something.
And
there.
Deborah's
sorry, Deborah.
She's also come in saying, I love this conflict slide. This has certainly been a time of conflict. Internal conflict, needs, etc. are still there. So there's obviously, internal pressures that still have to perhaps arise to the surface as we get back together as a team.
Deborah is so on the money with this, absolutely. And what I would also say, because I know that we'll be coming off on holiday, some of us might have already come off on holiday, congratulations. But as we come off on holiday, again, I put out that offer, which I've done for other people in previous sessions. I'm very, very happy to take a half-hour phone call from anybody who just needs half an hour to process some of this or to offload. And really for leaders just now, I know that space might be something that's welcome to just to chat through some of this and put it in its place. Because again, going back to fixing conflict, I don't believe that is what we can do. I think what it is about reframing it for ourselves and allowing ourselves to get into a resourceful place so that we can be resourceful for others to make the connections for themselves about how they can grapple with it and come out of that. So I've used this slide in a previous session with schools. I've also used it perhaps in one of my sessions, although in fact not in a webinar. I've not used this in a webinar before, and I'd like to just make mention of it now, this coaching with compassion. And you might want to use this for yourself as an individual, or again, you might want to use this as a team. Now, Richard Boyatzis and colleagues came up with this framework in his book last year called Helping People Change. And he talks about, focusing on your ideal self, your real self, so your ideal self, who is it you're becoming, you wish to be. And that might be helpful if we're thinking about, well, actually that adaptive leadership, I really want to focus on being that adaptive leader. What is it that I want from that, or I want to become? And then the real self, what's happening for me just now with that? What's the reality? And then he talks about the learning agenda, putting in those steps that are going to support us in moving forward. But their intentions, there has to be flexibility. We might not achieve all the goals. And I think with coaching, sometimes we can get bogged down in achieving goals and steps to the goals. But in fact, having learning intentions that can adjust, that can be flexible, that can adapt because it's uncertain, can be really helpful. Some things might drop off, other things might emerge. And then to explore and to experiment with some of these learning points for ourselves and just try these out. And recognising the resonant relationships, who supports us to become, as I think Anne-Theresa said, the best version of ourselves. So we might though want to use this can we use this for our own school community? What are the emerging needs and the appetites that will allow us to become a different kind of school? And what's that ideal school looking like for us just now? And where are we currently with that? And what have been the shifts with some progress with it? Otherwise, we wouldn't be looking at it. And what are some of the things that we might need to consider working on? And therefore, that learning agenda, what are the intentions for the year? A bit like a driver's plan, perhaps. And what do we want to just explore with, knowing that we'll just see where some of this goes, and it might not be so linear as we've perceived it before. But also this idea, and again focusing on these relationships, what do our relationships need to look like, sound like, feel like and be underpinned by for this to be successful for us. Now, the PEA and the NEA stands for positive emotional attractors and negative emotional attractors. Very fancy term from Boyatzis and his pals. However, it just really stands for, do you want it more than we don't want it? So do we want this change more than we don't want it? And although there might be anxiety, can those resonant relationships or our new relationships support us with some of that? I'm conscious of time. I have got hundreds of slides, which we will put on, but I'm maybe going to finish up with a couple of slides I think might be pertinent to what I've managed to get through today. And my apologies, I always plan, this happens in schools as well, I always plan so much more because I'm so excited to share so much with you, because I do want to help and support in the best way that I can. But
I can share other slides though in the PowerPoint that will go on the website, so people won't go without.
Oh, thank you so much. I think the last couple of slides I want to share, making some helpful assumptions about the situation. As a coach, I should never be going about making assumptions. That's where I get it all wrong. But maybe it's better to say we make some helpful beliefs, or we have some helpful beliefs that support us all with our teams just now. And maybe it's this, that we don't have all of the answers. We have some of the answers. No person actually has all of the answers. The scientists don't. The politicians don't. Our local councils are trying their best and they don't either at times. But here's the thing, have we ever had all of the answers? And the answer is no. And I wonder if there's something there about, you know, gently challenging our own teams to say, but we've never had the answers. Sure, we've maybe had more certainty regarding timetables, progress, where we're headed. But perhaps it's time now to challenge old beliefs and assumptions for ourselves and our approach to our team to make us resourceful, and to suspend beliefs, which is a good coaching technique, but also to recognise supporting team members to suspend their judgment and their beliefs as well. So please forgive me, I'm going to rattle through. Here are some of the slides that will be on offer. Fire, aim, fire is a good one as well to consider where we are in some of the planning that we have. And sometimes when it's aim, fire, aim, it isn't always going to be as productive for us in a time of uncertainty. And maybe it's about acting, reviewing and acting, exploring, reviewing and exploring. But I do want to finish up with this slide, which is taken from a book which other slides will refer to, called Getting Twice the Work Done in Half the Time, the Scrum Approach. And I bought the book with high expectations that I would half my workload. It was so exciting. Now, I can't say that I mastered that, but maybe it's because I've not implemented it all perfectly. But there are some great tips in it. It was really helpful. But one of the quotes from it that I thought was really helpful was this: there are no tasks, only stories. And I do wonder, as a kind of parting gift today, that as we move forward, it's not about getting through to-do lists and getting through all the things that need to be done. Sure, these are important and we do need to do all the practical things, but actually it's about the stories that bring those tasks into a place of meaning and collective sense making. And as a team, what is it that we want to be able to do so that our children and our young people can and fill in the blanks? And I think it's important that when people come to our school communities and they're making demands of us of, you know, we expect this and we expect that. Actually, in recovery, here's our recovery story. As a team, we want to be able to support each other, have compassion, focus on well-being, so that our children and our young people can feel included, can feel engaged, can feel a sense of achievement and accomplishment and progress as we move forward, just as a quick example. So what's your story? And the last kind of question that will feed into the next session is this, really. As leaders, what do you believe you are responsible for at this time in your role? And maybe it's always useful to look at, what are you not responsible for as you switch off for a thoroughly deserved summer holiday at the end of what can only be described as the wildest year in education ever since records began. And congratulations to you all for getting through it and for joining me today for some time to reflect. Thank you.
Claire, thank you very much for that whirlwind but very valuable presentation today. I can only thank you so much for sharing what you've shared and allowing our head teachers and school leaders to really take some time and space to think about where they are on this journey, and just reminders of actually it's okay to feel the way you might feel, and some solutions and ways to move forward. We've got a survey coming up, which Fraser will talk to you about, but I would really encourage our listeners to respond, because within the survey this time we've asked for specific themes for our next webinar that you are running on the 8th of July. So without any further ado, and without holding people back from the sunshine and a nice glass of wine in the garden, if that's accessible to you, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. I'll pass over to Fraser.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Claire, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, please contact communications@gtcs.org.uk. That's communications@gtcs.org.uk. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback, especially on the themes you would like Claire to explore in her next webinar on the 8th of July. As I mentioned previously, the materials from today's webinar will be available on our website and on MyPL by next week. On behalf of GTC Scotland, Claire, Sharon and myself, thank you for joining us today and enjoy your evening.